Oh, appreciate it. Appreciate it. Like I said, Dr. Todd DeKryger, the focus of my work with Nestle is to help our growers and our suppliers of fruits, vegetables, grains, bananas, coffee, cocoa, you name it, across the Nestle, um, across the globe, which basically is where Nestle, um, both sources and sells products. And so the concepts I'm talking about today are going to be fairly general because there again, what I would recommend here, say, so I'm living in Michigan, in the United States. So I'm in the, basically northern United States, which means, we certainly have snow. In fact, there's still a little bit of snow outside. I mean, we're up in the colder regions versus, southern regions, and obviously their climate is different. Yours certainly, when I visited Africa or when I visited South America, obviously dealing with very, very different growing conditions, but the concepts are the same. And so that's what I want to point out today in this presentation. So first off, I mean, we've all been experiencing, but also, seeing these weather challenges, for lack of a better term, in the news. There again, if you've been in farming, we've always dealt with issues with weather. It seems to be too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry. There again, up here in the North Country, we deal with frost issues. You see behind me a picture of an orchard. Every year growers are challenged to produce a crop because of a late frost. One cold night in May would wipe out the whole crop, and you have nothing to sell. So those weather challenges continue to plague us, to challenge us as farmers and producers. But depending on the reports that you hear, and I'm not here to debate climate change for or against, but it just seems like there's evidence showing that certainly in more recent times there's been more extreme weather events. So if you took the average of say you get 12 inches of rain a year, and historically you would pretty much get, maybe 1 inch a month, or 2 inches per month in the growing season, to get 12 inches, your average. It seems like you get that, you don't get anything until you get a 6-inch, weather rain event, and then all coming at once, and then unfortunately a lot of that just flood, goes away. You don't get the benefit of it. And so those more extreme weather events, and it's not just my perception. There's some data that shows that, and it's interesting. I was in a meeting with Dr. Lininger, who's an agricultural weather specialist with the University of Geneva in Switzerland, and his comment I thought was kind of interesting. Is basically said, look, surface water, so rain and stuff, is changing from being perennial, there again, what we typically get every year in a normal season, whatever that is, to episodic. So those major events, either you don't get enough and then you get too much, and then you don't get enough and you get too much. And so in preparing this presentation today, you can see there's a couple of headlines here in the last 2 days. Interesting enough, I subscribed to a Successful Farming magazine, and this was online, and farmers preparing for increased weather stress this spring. And then just yesterday, well, a couple of days ago, the United Nations came out with their most recent climate report, or climate change report, and so some doom and gloom predicted for the future, but point being, these conversations about weather and the impact of weather continue to this day. And so, so how can farmers, how can growers protect their crops in extreme weather? And really nothing we can do in the face of a hurricane is, on the farm or in the soil is going to, be able to deal with something like a hurricane, or, we get tornadoes here in the U.S., like Tulsa, Oklahoma, right, Bill? And those are just very catastrophic events that just there's not a whole lot. But what I'm talking more about is too hot, too cold, more drought, too much rain. How can farmers deal with those extreme weather events? So, okay, thinking on a global scale. So there again, I work for Nestle, and like so many other large corporations, Nestle's made these major global climate commitments. And you can see these are the headlines from just a few years ago. Nestle accelerates action to tackle climate change, commit to zero net emissions, so zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The 2050 pledge is what we refer to it in. And pick your very large multinational company. I think they've all pretty much subscribed to these types of commitments. And what are they really talking about? They're really talking about, look, greenhouse gases is any carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide, excuse me, methane, nitrous oxide, nitrous oxide. There's several others. Those are the biggies. But they're basically saying, look, we won't be able to, zero. When they say zero, it implies an equation, a mathematical equation. So, in these carbon accounting schemes, basically they're saying all of the efforts that you put into, all of the, the energy that's produced by power companies, which you then use to generate, use in your factory to create these food products. That's all has to be taken into account in terms of the carbon used, the energy used to create the electricity that is used in your factory to create the product, the food product in our case. That's all has to be accounted for, and that's on one side of the equation. But to get equals zero, you have to have a negative. That's a positive number. You have to have a negative number to equal zero. So what they're saying is, look, there's going to be some things that we can do in the environment to offset or sequester carbon, hold it into the soil, take it out of the atmosphere, hold it into the soil. And so that's where, the climate, that's where, forest and agriculture it comes into play, because that whole equation of the carbon cycle, actually what happens is, trees take in carbon dioxide and basically release oxygen, and they use that carbon to produce carbohydrates that are food for the tree and stored in the roots. Well, anyway, so that's taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in soil. So that reduces the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere, reduces greenhouse gas, or global, the whole warming, the greenhouse gas effect. And so that whole concept, there again, very, very, it's actually, well, I want to say it's a paper exercise, because you're just doing a calculation, calculating what you're releasing, and then calculating what potentially we could, sequester in the soil, therefore much equals zero. So there actually is a term called carbon accounting that there again, these companies are dealing with. Okay, so what? I'm a farmer. I'm located not next to Nestle. I don't sell to Nestle. So what? So what we're not going to focus on these. I mean, these are focused. These are large companies and government agencies that are all making these claims that we're going to help agriculture. So, but what the overall overarching concept is really developing resiliency. So when our growers ask us, so what do we do? I mean, look, Nestle said that we're going to work on sequestering carbon so that we get that net zero thing. That means in our supply chain, which means our our farmers, our suppliers of flour, or other food ingredients, are going to need to work towards sequestering more carbon. But so what does that? How does that help me as a farmer? So what we've been saying is, look, don't worry about the carbon. You know what? There's a lot of conversation about, agriculture is part of the problem because of the water we use and we're tilling and then releasing carbon into the soil, but it's also part of the solution because that put all of that aside. What is in it for me as a farmer? Focus on resiliency, because that's the concept that's going to ensure your long-term preservation as a grower, as a farmer, that you can produce for your family, you can produce, maintain or improve your own farm. That's the focus, for our growers, and that's the focus of this presentation this morning. So, okay, what do I mean by resiliency? Basically, what we're talking about is that ability of your farming system to withstand major impacts of the system. So, like I said, the extreme weather events, too hot, too cold, some climate change type of events, while providing a consistent, productivity, providing consistent crops for you and your family. And so that's what we're really focusing on here today. And one of the concepts that again, Nestle and all these large companies and so many universities are focusing on is this term called regenerative agriculture. And resiliency is one of the main benefits of adopting some of these regenerative practices of agriculture. And when we talk about regenerative agriculture, honestly, it is the remarketing of a lot of the concepts that have been around for many years that just growers have been doing, farmers have been doing across the globe, that just make good sense. But now we give it a new name and makes it sound very much more interesting in the news. But it's really a lot of the same concepts we've been working on for many years. And so, like so many others, Nestle comes up with a definition of regenerative agriculture, and you can see it here on the slide. What are the main pillars of regenerative agriculture? It's biodiversity. It's focusing on the soil, focusing on water, and livestock where feasible, where appropriate. But in the middle is the farmer, is that farming family, and that's why I kind of like this, because it's very general, but it puts the grower in the middle of the equation, because when all said and done, we're still producing food. If we were just going to try and save the world, we would plant a forest and quit farming, because the trees are sequestering carbon and all that stuff. That's not what we're all about. What we're talking about is we're still in a food production system. So what are the benefits of resiliency? Well, there's a number of them, and quite honestly, if we had more time, we could come up with even a larger list. But I've highlighted several of the most obvious, most largest benefits of resiliency in a farming system. And above ground, below ground, kind of split them that way. But quite frankly, during the presentation, you'll realize that there isn't one. These benefits flow back and forth. It's just above ground or just below ground. No, what happens below ground certainly impacts what's above ground, and what happens above ground impacts what's below ground. So anyway, what we're talking about is improved pest management. My background is in entomology. And horticulture, so I focus on that. But along those lines, it's maintaining increasing crop yield. When all is said and done, I have to be able to pay, make a livelihood off this land, and so crop yield is still important, even in regenerative this resiliency conversation. Crop yield is important, and crop quality goes right to that crop yield. If it's, if my crop isn't good enough to sell, that goes right to my bottom line as well. From a below ground standpoint, improving your water management, there again, in times of too much water or times of not enough water, improving the nutrient management, what helps that crop grow. Going back to the improved pest management, there are aspects of that occur below ground. And then kind of a newer concept here, this improved nutritional quality, and that's more towards what benefits we get as humans by eating the plant, as opposed to a little bit the nutrient management, which is more what is a plant getting benefiting from the soil. So, okay, great. I love those benefits. How do I get them? Well, so what we do in when we talk about resiliency and regen ag, there's two kind of concepts here. There's soil health and biodiversity. And so what do we mean by that? So soil health is really just increasing, see over here on the left side here, increase the ability of the soil to maintain that productivity, even during times of extreme events. And then on the biodiversity side over here, it's really expanding the number of unique species. So what do you mean by species? Well, it could be crop species, and we'll talk about crop rotation and cover crops and those kinds of things. It could be beneficial insects, those insects that attack the insect pests that seem to show up every year. In the biological system, if you think of the farm is more than just that plant that's growing, it's the whole farm and how that whole system needs to be addressed. And there again, unique species in biological system to buffer. In other words, those extreme events, we really can't do anything about them, but what we can do is buffer the system so that it can tolerate too much heat, or it can tolerate colder than normal temperatures to the system. So there again, if you look at the two lists here, and well, what kind of these are practices, and there's just a very short list. You can make this list much longer than what it is, but the practices kind of there again, we'll kind of separate them, tease them out into two different categories here. They're in soil health and biodiversity. But if you look at the first five here, they're exactly the same, which goes back to, look, these are not mutually exclusive. Your soil health is based a lot on the biodiversity below soil, and the biodiversity is also supported by soil health. So things like cover crops or reducing the tillage or keeping the soil covered at all times, those are concepts, those are practices that encourage both soil health and biodiversity. And I don't intend to go through this whole list one by one, but you can see that if you think about that a concept of what can we do to support soil health, or what can we do to support the biodiversity, there again, this list is not mutually exclusive. There's a number of different other practices that can go on this list. So historically, agriculture has been tillage based, and it for good reason, quite frankly. Whether it's the picture at the top, or they're something a little more higher tech, I guess you could say, down at the bottom, we were tilling the soil for some really good reasons, like creating a proper seed bed, the good soil contact for the seeds, and warming up. Again, up here in the North Country here, where our season is short enough, warming up the soil prior to planting. It makes total sense. Or weed control. They say, what is a weed? A weed is the wrong plant, any plant in the wrong place at the wrong time. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's we just don't want it there. it's a bad plan. It's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so weed control certainly has been a reason for the mechanical control of species that we didn't want there. Been doing that for many years. Creating a smooth surface that helps with harvest. We talked about a smooth surface helping with planting, but especially if you're using, a combine or gleaner or some kind of mechanical harvest where you want the soil surface to be as uniform as possible. Well, then having that smooth surface, you can help improve that through tillage. And then finally, the last part is, okay, you've grown that crop and all of the residues, the stalk, the stem that you're not harvesting, you're leaving in the field. You want to get that into the soil. We've been incorporating that, or tillage would put that into the soil and facilitate its breakdown. So, like I said, historically, a lot of good reasons why we were out there tilling. But as we kind of switch gears a little bit, and then we focus more on what's happening in the soil and why do we want to improve that soil health. So if we think about the biology, so the what's happening in the soil, the microorganisms, the bacteria, the fungi, the insects, everything that's happening in the soil, that's the biology. And as we drill down below, quite frankly, what we can see to what we can't see, now you're starting to talk about this concept of the microbiome. And so what is a microbiome? Well, there's fungi, there's bacteria, there's other organisms, simple organisms going on in the soil that are beneficial to our plant. In fact, our plants can't live without them, and which is kind of the concepts we've been learning. We're still learning. And they call it a symbiotic relationship. So the fungi and the bacteria do things for the plants, and the plants do things for the fungi and bacteria. They're promoting each other. If you see on the example on the right side here, we're working with a group called Biome Makers, and what they really are doing is they're identifying all of those organisms that are in the soil. So you can see here the fungi and the bacteria and different types of fungi. Both of these are arbuscular and ectomycorrhizae are positive. They're good fungi in the soil, and this is just a representation of the different relative populations. And this was just a farm that we soil sample that we took, and interesting enough, they identified 773 different species in the soil of fungi. These simple, protist is a simple organism. Bacteria, archaea are kind of almost very similar to bacteria. In fact, they used to be considered part of the bacteria family. These are all different organisms that have a role in the soil, and these are actually positive. Well, you want those in there, and so like I said, you can see the example I talk about with legumes. Planting peas and planting beans of this type of, or alfalfa or some of these other legumes. They actually have a relationship with a type of bacteria called, in this case, Rhizobium bacteria, which actually fixes nitrogen, in the atmosphere. So in other words, the air, there's nitrogen in the air, it's about 82% nitrogen. Air that we breathe is 82% nitrogen, but it's obviously in gas form. And because the soil has the ability to have oxygen in it, soil needs oxygen in it. What the bacteria do is they actually fix that nitrogen, they take the nitrogen out of that air, and they make it available for the plant. So the legume plant, the pea plant, or the chickpea or cowpea or whatever, the legume plant gets the nitrogen from the bacteria. And part of that whole process is that in response, the bacteria, the plant leaks. They talk about leaks carbohydrates to feed the bacteria. So they're feeding each other, and it's a mutual or symbiotic relationship. And so that's a very important example of how there again, what's going on in the soil, it helps the plants that you're trying to grow. Another concept. So we're trying to enhance that microbiome in improving our soil health. Another concept is the soil organic matter. So this is basically, it's a component of soil. It's composed of the living and dead things. So like there again, the stalks and the stems that you don't use, and you incorporate it back into the soil, that is turning into soil organic matter. And they're decomposing and becoming available for use by the plant. And there again, they're particles in the soil. They're negatively charged. Think of taking a magnet. You got positive and negative charges, and so positive binds to a negative. So these are particles in the soil that actually have a negative charge to them, and they bind positively charged plant nutrients like calcium, phosphorus, sulfur in the soil and hold them so that they make them available for the plant. So enhancing your soil organic matter is a very, very good thing. So another aspect of improving the soil health is really just managing to conserve water. Certainly areas of the globe that have a rainy season and a dry season certainly understand this. Obviously we even here in the United States, we have areas where it's very dry, and then during the wintertime we get rain or something like that. So but that whole concept is very, very familiar to everybody. So what you want to do though is maintain that water, enough water to carry that plant through to hopefully to maturity, even if it gets dry. And so what we're trying to do is increase the water retention, but by the same token, it also is able to handle excess water, and because they call them aggregates, the soil becomes not just very fine pieces of particles. They become aggregates, the chunks in the soil that you see, and that allows a lot of space in between the aggregates, which allows for air to get down into there. There again, air, we need that oxygen down in the soil, but it also allows water to go right on through, and it captures some of that water in the spaces of the organic matter and some of the other particles that the plant can actually access later. So once it becomes dry, yes, okay, it handled that rain event better. It didn't flood. The water, seeped down into the soil. The soil was able to capture it. Yes, some, sank down below even the lower levels, but it captures the water and it captures the nutrients in a place where plants can access it later in drier times. So that's one thing, increasing the water retention. Another one is reducing erosion. Certainly wind erosion, certainly water erosion, by having that soil exposed on the surface, that you're just subject to wind blowing away your soil. It's subject to water washing away your soil, and then also reducing the surface evaporation. And this is a very important concept that we don't think about when we're doing all this tillage, but basically keeping the soil shaded significantly reduces that surface temperature. And here's, you can see the example of that we've got here. Again, this is from this Dr. Leninger from University of Geneva. But so basically pointed the thermometer at this, okay, it's in the shade, it's in the grass, and sure enough, you got 25 degrees centigrade. Okay, then out in the sunshine, but yet pointing at a lush green foliage. Okay, yes, temperature rose to 30 degrees centigrade, and pointing at, it looks like it's rye, pointing at this rye field that's, okay, it's not lush and green, but it's still there, and it's still covering the soil, just about the same temperature, 31. Then he actually pointed it at the road, and okay, because he figured that was going to be the hottest surface in a nice sunny day, and yep, sure enough, it's about 54 degrees centigrade. But then he pointed it at, went on into a field with obviously foliage growing, pointed at the bare plant or soil surface at 61. The hottest temperature was here on the bare, soil surface. So what is those temperatures doing? Well, two things. One, it's certainly increasing the evaporation of water, valuable water. But then it also is any of those microorganisms that you really want in the soil, when you turn over the soil, you bring all those up to the surface, and they get fried in the sun just like other things. And so you lose those microorganisms when the soil is exposed to sunlight at that point. So maintaining that thought process. So how do you improve your soil? Keeping it soil covered, maintaining that soil structure by avoiding excess tillage. There again, we go back to, yep, tillage has a purpose, but understanding its role and when you should be tilling and when you shouldn't be tilling, what are the other options for tillage? There again, excess tillage destroys that soil structure, those aggregates. It breaks it down into really fine particles, which then reduces the amount of oxygen and reduces the amount of water that can be let into the soil. And then concepts like mulching, and you can see on the right here, this was actually, it was an organic squash field in which we were using the rye, crimped it over, basically just flattened it out just before, as you can see, it was just going into the heading stage in the spring. They flattened it over, covered up. The rye actually is doing several different things. It's shading the soil to keep the soil temperature down, so it's holding the moisture there. It's also, ironically, interesting enough, most plants have, well, all plants have their own defense systems in them. Typically, well, in the case of rye, it's actually a chemical that the rye plant releases as it's breaking down, that actually acts like a natural herbicide. It literally inhibits the germination of other seed varieties, and that's a plant defense mechanism. Allows the rye to compete better than some of the other species. So anyway, this is, you can see there, basically it's a nice mat on the surface of the soil. It's doing several different benefits to the soil. And so those are kind of strategies that can be incorporated as well to, there again, into the system in lieu of tillage. And there again, go back to talking about managing weeds. So there again, we'll talk about the rye here. So that's it's a cultural. You could argue it's a natural chemical way of managing weeds as well. There again, because of those chemicals that the rye leaks out of the stems as it decomposes. But the concept of mulching, shading weeds are it's another cultural aspect. Yes, the mechanical at some point, unfortunately, some kind of mechanical type of weed control, ends up being the most viable option. Hoeing, still very used extensively across the globe. And then, like to more think about the chemical controls, herbicide use. all of them have their place, and there again, as we're trying to understand what's happening, the dynamics of the system, we're trying to go towards these more natural ways of controlling weeds, the unwanted plant species in the desired crop. And then the other concept is maintaining live roots or living roots at all times. So certainly in areas, warmer climates where you can put in more than one crop, that's just kind of one comes in right after the other. You know, that what that is doing is you're continuing to feed the microorganisms. You're feeding that microbiome and causing it to flourish. And you're also holding the soil in place. We talked about erosion, and there again, establishing the next crop. There again, up here in Michigan, well, we plant our winter wheat. So we plant it in the fall, get the winter snow on it, comes up in the spring, and then about the middle, July is when we're harvesting our wheat. But what we do is this time of year is we actually we'll just, so the wheat is coming out of its dormancy, but before it gets too tall, we actually go out and we just spread seeds of clover right in the rye or right in the wheat in the spring. And the freezing and thawing, the early spring yet, actually plants the seed. And so it germinates, the rye, the clover germinates within the rye or within the small grain, the wheat or barley. And then by the time you harvest the barley, and I got a picture I'll show you later, but time you harvest the barley, the clover crop is right there. So the barley is dying or the wheat is died, your time to harvest, but then you have the next crop right there. So it's that continuously keeping plants in the ground, as opposed to, historically, in many areas, clean tillage or set aside, or there's several different terms for it, where you would, you literally just, plow the soil and to capture the rain, because you didn't get a whole lot of rain, and then you quick plant the wheat crop or whatever it was. That concept, you're trying to get away from that, because basically what you're doing is we'll go back to what we were just talking about, exposing the microorganisms to the sunshine and the wind, and you're losing. There's a lot of reasons why we want to go away from that clean tillage, set aside, those concepts, and move to this where we're having some type of crop in the ground all the time. So from an improving soil health standpoint, if you think about improving soil structure, there's almost kind of a cascading effect. So when you reduce the compaction and you encourage that soil aggregate development, maybe through reducing your tillage, what it does, like I said, increases the space between the soil particles. When that happens, you increase the air and the water infiltration. When that happens, it holds more water that can be accessed by the plant roots in dry times, which promotes root growth, plant root growth, which means that the roots have more access to the nutrients, which means that you increase the plant nutrient uptake, which means you have, proper levels of nutrients of the plant in the plant, so that the plant has the ability to fight off insects and diseases. Just like us, when we, have good nutrition, good balanced diet, we're more able to, ward off diseases. So like I said, it's almost a cascading effect. When you do this, then there are other repercussions or benefits, actually, other benefits by the process. So then the last concept I was talking about in terms of soil health. So improving the nutritional quality, and that's actually, it's interesting because historically it's been all about yield. I need bigger yields, bigger crops, and so a lot of the science has gone into improving yield. But what they're really finding out is, and they can I've seen that in several different crops over time, you know, nutrients like protein in soybeans. I actually just saw that a couple weeks ago, where charting the average soybean protein in soybeans from 20 years ago versus today, it's lower. Well, what's going on there? Well, probably two things, and the jury's still out on that, a definitive cause. But there's two lines of thought here. One is, basically, as organic matter decreases, as a lot of times, there again, some of these practices have been reducing the health of the soil. The soil can't provide the nutrients that the plant needs to maximize the protein or maximize some of the other nutrients that humans benefit from. So that's one thing. And there again, you can see on my slide here, whether it's beta carotene or vitamin A or some of these other essential nutrients. There is a lot of thought and a lot of investigation, research going on right now, trying to understand what that soil does for the nutrient levels in crops. And then historically, and there's another term here, nutrient dense. Maybe you've heard that term, or if you ever hear that term in the future, that's what they're talking about. Really, what's the nutritional value of that crop, and how can we make it more nutritionally valuable, regardless of the crop. And then the other thought is, too, plant breeders, when they're breeding for, use the example of soybeans, plant breeders have been focusing on yield, or, I guess with soybeans, you could talk about, resistance to Roundup or glyphosate, some other attribute other than protein levels, other than, some other human benefit. And so there's kind of been a shift in at the plant breeding level too, where, okay, we've been focusing on yield so much, or height of the plant, or dynamics of the plant, that we really haven't been focused on. Now we should be also focusing on increasing the protein in soybeans. And ask any plant breeder and they'll say, look, it's all trade-off. What, one trait versus the other. There's no perfect soybean, and there's no perfect apple. There's trade-offs when you're doing the plant breeding. Do you want higher yield, or do you want this trait? And so, again, they've been emphasizing the higher yield because that's what farmers wanted, to the sacrifice of some of these other traits. And now they're saying, well, okay, some of these other traits are important enough that now let's focus in on those as well. Yeah, we want the yield, but let's focus in on improving protein levels. And you can see down in the right-hand corner, I'm actually involved in a research project looking at soil health with a group called the Rodale Institute, and trying to understand, there again, protein quality, and the nutraceutical amino acid ergothioneine. Basically, it's one of hundreds, thousands of proper human health indices that we're getting from food. Actually, this ergothioneine is fairly new. We didn't even realize we were getting that benefit from it. And so understanding that aspect of plant nutrition. It could have been protein, could have been something else. And you see it actually mentions protein, but this other compound called ergothioneine. So then, kind of switching gears to the increasing biodiversity. So I talked about the better pest management. So when you're encouraging biological control of insect pests, what we're doing, in other words, say like for aphids, you're encouraging ladybird beetles or ladybugs or green lacewings or some of these other insects that feed on the aphids, or insects that feed on the whiteflies that feed on our plants. Basically letting nature control the pest instead of us having to do all of the work ourselves. So, or, working with nature instead of against nature. I've heard it, explained in a number of different ways, but basically encouraging that biological control of insects, enhancing that habitat, attract beneficial insects. So whether in the case of some of the insects, it's not the adult that feeds, it's the larvae, the adult, the egg, the larvae, then you get the adult again. So it's the juvenile stage that feeds on the insect pest. But you got to get the adult to come to your crop, so to lay the egg, which can hatch, and and then you have the larvae that feeds on the pest. So something like nectar rewards, they feed the adults feed on nectar. So by putting flowers or those types of some certain species specific to the biological the insect that you want to attract, they're again very specific. So I can't tell you you must plant clover because that will attract this, because in your growing region, in your farming system, it's probably not where you want to attract the native beneficial insects. So, but anyway, they're different insects or different biological controls. You're encouraging their development different ways. The other thing is they're again reducing the crop damage due to insects and diseases. There improves the quality and preserves that yield. So it really comes back to the bottom line. You want to maximize the amount of saleable crop, and a lot of that has to do with not letting the insects and diseases have that crop. Then the other aspect is pollinators. There again, the picture behind me here is an apple orchard. Those apples are pollinated by bees or other insect pollinators. So, encouraging those pollinators, both natural and we use commercial beehives for commercial orchards, but enhancing the farming system to encourage those pollinators is definitely a way of creating the next crop. And then certainly sometimes pesticides they're needed, but then also keeping in mind what not only the target pests that you're going after, but what are the impacts to your beneficial insects, because certainly some of the broad spectrum insecticides that are available, will also certainly will kill the pests, but they also can kill or harm your beneficial insects. So understanding that whole system and what's going on in your particular situation is very important. So increasing biodiversity. So we talk about intentional crop rotation. So the picture of coffee, it's perennial crop, so it's really not a rotational thing. But there are other concepts that you can use in a perennial crop situation that, like you can see here, this picture Asia got this from one of the Nestle coffee agronomists, that they were growing, I believe that's potatoes. So they're growing a different species between the coffee as the coffee is maturing, and so that obviously they're getting an additional crop, but that introducing a different species there again is feeding a certain part of the microbiome and encouraging that soil health. So each crop in the rotation should obviously, it's got to generate profit. I mean, that's a short-term game, but certainly that's the bottom line is the bottom line. So, but that depends obviously on available markets. Just because I want to grow potatoes between my coffee here doesn't mean I have a market for the potatoes. So there's that aspect that going on, and then certainly depends on the crop timing. Obviously dry season, rainy season, that comes into, that plays an important aspect of those dynamics as well. But the other aspect in addition to generating the profit, is more of a long-term gain, and that's building that resiliency into the system. So there again, the crop rotation. Obviously, where feasible is a very important strategy for increasing that resiliency. Planting a crop year after year actually allows those soil-borne pest populations to increase over time to the point where when conditions are optimum, you see crop failures, or you see very devastating impacts on the crops you're trying to grow. So doing that crop rotation where possible breaks that cycle and there again, rotating different crops, families of crops. So growing wheat and then growing rye and then growing barley and then growing wheat, then rye and then barley, they're all very similar plants. Many of the same, diseases, insects affect all three. So putting a legume in that system, say rye this year, you saw the clover, rye, clover, barley, clover, rye, break up that system with different types of families, suppresses those insects and diseases, but there again also helps build resiliency into the system long term. So here's my picture of the clover on the left here. Clover, you can see the stubble from the wheat. So I harvested the wheat, and a week later, boy, that clover is just thriving because now it's been exposed to the sunlight. It's got all the, and it's germinated. It is ready to go. It's ready to thrive. And 3 weeks after the picture was taken, you couldn't even see the stubble. The clover was just taken off. It loved it. So there again, the plant nutrient management, talking about cover crops. In my example, clover is one, but there again, each cover crop has a certain purpose in that rotation as well. So say whether it's rye is a good nutrient scavenger. So any of the nutrients from the crop before, rye is very deep rooted. So it'll go down and grab those nutrients and bring them back up towards the surface. As opposed to allowing them to leach down into the groundwater. We talked about the legumes and adding nitrogen to the system, and then there again, different species, different soil microorganisms. And then there again, the organic fertilizers, manure and compost availability, whether it's by, as you can see here, whether it's by wheelbarrow or something a little bit larger, that manure and compost can be a very valuable, I would say commodity, very valuable input, especially when synthetic fertilizers are not available. But even when they are, I mean, even our commercial growers here in North America are moving towards trying to find sources of manure, trying to find sources of compost, because that adds, there again, more robustness to the system. The only caveat I can put is just be careful with when you're using raw manure. It's that whole concept of the microbiological issues, and you don't want to be transferring diseases like E. coli and salmonella, into the new crop. So that's certainly some thought behind the use of this valuable resource. So, okay, we've talked about improving soil health, and we also talked about increasing biodiversity. The whole concept of technology in agriculture, and you'd see online all these wonderful advertisements for all these different types of technology, and I too go, oh man, I really need this stuff? Otherwise I can't be a good farmer, right? Well, yes and no. They all have their place. They all are a tool, whether it's their genetic modification or gene editing or whatever, whether it's the use of agricultural drones and that type of technology, or GPS guided the precision agriculture. They all have their place. They all can be a valuable tool, but in the end, All these technologies rely on healthy soil to be successful. It always comes back to the soil and the biodiversity within the soil and that soil health. All of these technologies by themselves are just technologies. They are not the end all. Like I said, the end of the day, it still comes back to how do you develop that healthy soil. So here's my summary slide. So how do you increase that resiliency? How do you make your farms be able to weather the weather? I can say that. Be able to remain productive even with these extreme weather events. Going back to what we talked about, encouraging the biodiversity in the system, make your system, your whole farming system, more robust. And so that's not just even thinking about the field, it's thinking about what's around the perimeter of the field, what's on the outside, what beneficial insects might be coming in from the trees or the grass on the outside. So it's thinking of farming as a whole system. As I talked about, feed and protect your soil, keeping that soil covered, avoiding excess tillage, understanding exactly what the tillage is doing for you, the positives and the not so positives, maintaining live roots at all possible, whenever possible. And there again, that whole concept of adding the livestock as a natural source of plant nutrition. So that's my presentation. I guess I haven't been looking at the chat, sorry. Shall we just go to the chat and see what's in there?
Let me give you just a short break and do my last poll that I have. We had good results from the first one, but let me launch this poll and if you would answer, there's only a few questions. If you would answer them, that would be helpful and give Todd a little bit of a break to get his mouth wet again. And okay, so I posted a poll, resilience in farming number 2, and there's 5 questions. So if you could answer that, that would be helpful. Then we'll look at it briefly, and then we'll go to a time of questions. And I've got a couple of the questions written down, but then after that, we'll take questions from the audience. Okay, so let's just take a few minutes and answer the questions. Do you see the poll, Todd? No, okay.
No, I don't. Oh, wait. Did I just click the poll?
All right, we've got 11 so far. Give it a couple more minutes.
Where would I go to see the results of that first poll?
I'll bring those up in
Okay.
in a minute. And so we can see it. So we'll go over the two polls quickly, and I hope. All right, going, last call. Ready? Let's end it, and then here's the results of this second poll. It looks like out of 11 participants, 9 of them have rain alone as a form of watering their crops. 2 use irrigation. Number of farmer-owned cooperatives that provide access to improved crop varieties. Only 1 out of 11 have access. The rest do not. Majority of weather challenges you face in your farm. Majority, it's definitely drought and high temperatures. You receive farming advice from professional agronomists. Well, some of you do, almost half of you do, 4 out of 11 as opposed to 7 after 11. Number 5, what is the greatest limiting factor on your farm that prevents you from expanding your crop production? 2 of you said irrigation. 5 said finances, money. 1 said quality of seed. Another mechanization that's really spread out. And 1's the landowner rights. So that's the second one. Should I go ahead and post the first one, Todd?
Please.
Okay, let's see what the first one. Oh, sorry. All right, so can you see the results?
Not yet.
Doesn't show a way of making it visible. Let me just read it. What countries are represented? Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, Kenya. And I saw someone from Tanzania there as well. They didn't take the test. What type of crops do you grow? Vast majority, 8 out of 9. There's only 9 participants that answered the poll. 8 out of 9, it's maize. 4 out of 9 is rice. 1 out of 9 is sugarcane, and 1 out of 9 is coffee. 1 out of 9 is millet. 3 out of 9 is beans, and 1 out of 9 is other. Do you have livestock on your farm? It's almost half and half. 4 out of 9 said yes. 5 out of 9 said no. Okay?
Okay.
All right, so here's a couple of questions that were posted. Can genetically modified crops and seeds be one solution to climate change?
So genetically modified crops are a tool, and I use the concept of a toolbox. You know what? And in that toolbox, in a really good toolbox, you have a bunch of different tools. You know, you wouldn't use a hammer, you know, to try and get a screw out. You use a screwdriver. You wouldn't use a screwdriver to try and pound in a nail. You use a hammer. So, you know, every tool has its place. Does genetic modification have its place? Yes. You know, there again, there's been some focus in breeding plants to resist drought. You know, drought resistant maize, so or corn. So you know, yeah, there are examples of where, where genetic modification can certainly help maintain food production even with climate change. You know, is genetic modification going to save us all? I'm not ready to go there yet. There again, it's one tool in the toolbox.
Good. How about crop rotation as a way to control pests?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It is one of the best ways to control well, a lot of pests. A lot of pests have a part of their life cycle in the soil. Well, if they don't have anything to feed on, if they're very specific to feed on wheat and you have clover in the ground, they starve to death. And vice versa. So that crop rotation, the more robust you can make the crop rotation. In other words, the more species you can put into that crop rotation, the better off you are. Going back to that example though that I gave, well, don't rotate, rye, wheat, barley, rye, wheat, barley, because the same diseases, soil-borne diseases, same insect for the most part impact all three. So even though you're rotating different species, different crop, they're all feeding the same pests. So that's why those different families, grow maize one year and grow potatoes in the same spot the next year, and then grow, a legume, a bean, and then grow, so you're rotating, and there's a very distinct different families of plants that have basically you're suppressing those insects diseases. Yes, absolutely. It's one of the best ways of controlling pests long term.
Thank you. Let's see. Oh, Benjamin asks, how is grading done for quality products?
Well, it's a different, certainly grading grading is different for every individual crop and every different market. So, okay, they're coming, crops coming to Nestle. So they're getting apples in the background here. We can't have worms in our apples. Okay, so if there are worms in those apples, if they're too bad, we have to reject the whole, the whole lot. Hopefully they're not. Usually they're not. So, but then, we actually, they call it an inspection belt. So back, each apple gets looked at, they put it on a conveyor belt and look at it, and if it's acceptable, then it goes into the proper bin. If it's not, then it gets culled out. You put it in a different bin, and it goes into a lesser, or if it's a really worst bin, it ends up going out to being cow feed. Quite frankly, we can't use it in our food, so our food products. So it becomes so very much a salvage operation. I mean, it's a very low quality. So that grading depends on, some of it, they're sorting. So there's sorting equipment, especially with grain, and something that's very uniform, and then you can use various different screens and blowers and stuff that will separate heavier versus lighter. So that happens all the time as well. But in terms of grading, every crop has a grade that must meet a minimum expectation for the buyer. So something that's going in the fresh market versus something that's going into, a Nestle product. I don't care if the apple is not very red. I'm taking the skin off anyway, right? I'm just using the flesh inside. But in the fresh market, certainly in North America, they expect that apple to be really nice and red. And so going for the fresh market versus going to, a processing market, it is different. The grading is different regardless, depends on the market.
Okay, that's a little on the broad side, huh? There's no universal standard.
There's no universal standard. There's universal standards, but in other words, the apple for fresh market here in the U.S. would be almost identical to the apple fresh market in Europe, almost identical to fresh market in many other places. But yeah, but apples versus oranges is very different. And fresh market versus processing is very different.
Okay. Pastor Theo asks, have you experimented in natural worm repellent products?
Worm repellent. In other words, it's. I guess I'm not quite sure exactly what they're talking about. We work with a lot of biological control products, which means yes, some of those. So they're going. Plants have their own natural defense systems. They can't run and hide. They're right there, and so they try to repel insect pests. And so a lot of times those discouraging insects from feeding on the plant, they actually create chemicals that the plant somehow signals the insect pest that they don't want to feed on this. And so those kind of products are now really coming into the market, where you're repelling. Neem is a very classic case where some insects don't, and some insects don't want to even land on it, much less lay their eggs on it, much less feed on it. It's just whatever chemical is in neem, insects just don't want it. It repels them. So we are working with those kinds of products. Yes.
Just to ask Todd, can we get a PDF of your slide presentation?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
All right, if you would do that, I'll post my email on the chat line, and then if you would like a copy of it, you can just contact me and say I would like a copy of Todd's presentation. Okay, this is being recorded, so you'll have access also to the recording of it. All right, let's go. Did you want to add?
Well, I was just going to say, I was looking at the poll, and one of the reasons why we asked the question about the farming advice is, nobody has all the answers, and so, seeking out those good sources of information are really important. Even the professional farmers in North America, they have other people that they're seeking out advice from, and so I know it's certainly within the Nestle network globally. We really encourage farmer cooperatives, because then they can designate one person who has been able to study the science and support a number of different growers. Or there again, my group does that for our Nestle growers locally here as well. But reaching out and having that source of good sound information is important to everybody in farming.
Yeah, I think that we're all beginning to really see that and to value it for our particular, especially for our particular area. In other words, you can't, as an expert, speak to all areas. It's a little difficult, but you can encourage farmers to learn from one another as well as from the experts in their area. What I'd like to do is open this up and ask if you have any questions. Just unmute and I will try and let you speak. So is there any questions that you would like to ask Todd from his presentation? Well, Todd, I think you've done such an excellent job that you've answered all the questions. Anyone?
Well, yeah, it's not a question. It's an appreciation. Thank you so much, Todd. Actually, the presentation has opened my mind to a lot of things around improving soil quality and then seed quality as well. Then the perspective of the crop rotation. I think it gives an overview for what we are able to do in times of becoming resilient towards that. But maybe before I drop, it is some of the microbiome you mentioned earlier, like improving the fungi, bacteria, beneficial fungi, bacteria in the soil where you farm. Are there products? Are there products like how to go about that, or do we just have the mulching system that can improve that, or are there like products you can put in the farm in
Yes.
the beneficial good? Okay.
Yes, there are quite a few. Having said that, what maybe worked in a laboratory, in a very controlled setting versus what these products might work in a laboratory, but they don't necessarily work at the field level. So there's much is being learned about some of these products and what they can and cannot do in the soil. So yes, there are products out there. A word of caution, because some of them are not quite as effective as what the advertisement or the salesman says they are. If you
Okay.
understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of that can be done just basically there again with those correct practices at the soil level. They're like we just talked about. You mentioned them as well. Keeping the soil covered, keeping those live roots, doing the crop rotation, the manure. So yes, manure is bringing nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the NPK of that you would get in a fertilizer, but it's also bringing a lot of that other biological activity along with it. And so that's why a lot of our conventional growers are actually using finding sources of manure and compost to work into the rotation, because they're getting benefits from manure that they can't get from a commercial fertilizer. So I yes, there are products out there, but I would encourage you to try and do it the more natural way.
Thank you, Dr. Gaga.
Thank you.
Let me invite Larry. Larry Alsam is a farmer in the U.S. and also has done work in Ghana. So, Larry, did you have anything to add? Or
Hey, Larry.
Do you know Larry, Todd?
We have our paths have crossed. Yep.
Are you there, Larry? You're muted if you're there. Okay. I've posted my email address, and as soon as I get the PDFs of the slides, I will be happy to send them out. But please, I won't have access to these chats, so email me at phil@dmleaders.org. Okay, last call. All right, on behalf of all of us that have been on this call and many others that will benefit from this later on, we want to thank you, Todd, for this time that you've shared. I think that the topic is incredibly important. Yvonne, are you waiting? Are you going to ask your question?
No,
Oh.
I just decided to show up visually.
Okay, thanks, Yvonne.
I've been
All right,
in and
so
out and in
the-
and out all the way through.
So, thank
Let
you
me do
so
the
much.
same.
Oh, look at that. They're showing up in person. Anyone else?
Now we are about to go and collect.
Thank you, Theo. Oh, there's Caroline. Thank you from Kenya. You, Ghana, Nigeria. Anyone else? All right, let me, in fact, Dr. Gaga, would you do me a favor?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Gaga, you'd have to realize this, Larry, is he lives in his car. I don't know if he actually ever goes out of the house, but probably 90% of the time you'll find him in the car. I'd like to ask a question. You've answered a question that we have theologically. When we do our foundational workshop, we talk about the Garden of Eden. Did the Garden of Eden have weeds? And your definition of a weed as a plant in the wrong place at the wrong time would lead us to believe, yes, there were technically weeds in the Garden of Eden that required cultivation by Adam. So thank you for that theological answer to that extremely important question. Okay, Dr. Gaga, it's up to you. Can you close in prayer?
Okay, let's pray together. Father, we want to thank you. We give you praise because, God, you're worthy. Thank you, mighty Redeemer, for Todd. Thank you for giving him the wisdom and also the willingness to share with us what he knows. We pray that you increase his wisdom, bless his work. And for all of us who have participated, we ask that in our little way, whatever we are doing in cultivation, that God, you will bless it. Even as the rains have come in this season, across the world, across each country, as it depends, that God, whatever we will plant this year, you will bless it, you will multiply it, and we will see fruitfulness in the name of Jesus. Thank you for Papa Phil and Renita, who are organizing this and mobilizing all this work. Father, bless them and increase their strength. Thank you for Renita as she travels. We believe that we will receive good news of her safe arrival. Be exalted and be praised, Lord. In Jesus' name we have prayed. Amen.
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 And God bless
Amen.
each and every one of you.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
And
Amen.
Todd,
Bye.
once again, thank you so much.
Amen.
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 Safe travels.
Thank you.
God bless.
God
Good to
bless.
see you.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye, Yvonne. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. God bless you. I'm going to close us out.